Welcome to 20th Century Music and Arts. Here is part 3 of my conversation with Byrne Power, the Anadromist, and this is our final conversation about the musical eras of the post-World War II 20th century. In this episode, we cover the years from the beginning of the 1980s right up to the early part of the millennium.
Okay, well, we are back with James Wallace from 20th Century Music and Arts, the mysterious James Wallace. I have to make you a logo here. I have to do that. I can do it very easily. Okay, so we are back with part 3 of our musical eras of the late 20th century. We started essentially with the post-World War II era. And in the first one, we went from the post-World War II era into the 60s, touching on the 70s. And in the second one, we spent a lot of time in the 70s, where there was a lot of musical development. I mean, my feeling was if the 60s had a lot of ideas about culture, the 70s had a lot of ideas about music. Do you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a birth of numerous genres then, so for sure.
Yeah, it's when you start getting, expertise and people who really know their instruments and are very, very good at them in all sorts of different categories. And even the rebellion of the 70s was, the punk stuff and whatnot, what we'd later call punk new wave and all of that was very intelligently done.
For sure.
In the year 1980, we've got basically two things going on at once. One is there is an overground culture, and this is especially in North America. There's an overground culture, which is very slick, very sleek. It's, there's a kind of a commercialized hard rock. There's a, what of the new wave they let through is stuff like the Cars, or, the one big pseudo-punk hit was the Knacks, My Sharona.
Yes. Skinny tie bands, yeah.
Yeah. Meanwhile, groups like Journey, Foreigner, Toto are all, big hit items. And then you've got a lot of very commercial music coming on. And I think at this point, the big thing that's going to define this new era, now this is just for the mainstream culture, and we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but it's going to be MTV and video and these large arena concerts, which are different than the ones in the 70s, which tended to be groups, lots of groups playing. These are going to now be something very different. They're going to be a few mega stars.
Yeah.
And so, what was your feeling about the, now how old were you, like around 1980?
Well, I would have turned 7 in 1980. I do remember. You became
conscious of music around, 12 years old or so?
Yeah, but I remember the early 80s very well. So, I mean, just looking at it objectively, you definitely had, in the 80s, people going into sort of a little bit of different identity groups, even in the mainstream. Mm-hmm. So what you said about slick production is absolutely accurate. So whether we're talking about rock, rhythm and blues, or country and western, the production became very, very slick. What also became a big factor is, yes, there were still people producing albums, but it seemed like the singles in the charts and the related video to go along with it was what is really being pushed by record companies. So if you have to have the hit single and the hit video. So that's why in that environment, you can't have something to the same degree as like prog rock or any of these sort of like epic conceptual albums you have from the 70s, because the emphasis is very much on the single, and more importantly, the appearance of the artists on video. So
Exactly.
the visuals was a huge factor.
That's one of the reasons that prog failed to make big hits, unless they changed somehow, like Genesis and Phil Collins did, is that the prog bands were not visually interesting for MTV. They didn't know how to package themselves. And so what was needed was something, and I think that one of the main sources of the new stylization coming from MTV was British, what we would have called new wave bands, but now becoming things like the New Romantics. And you had groups like the Eurythmics was an early band that really caught with their Sweet Dreams Are Made of This. Although they've got a lot of new wave edge to them still. Nevertheless, it's that kind of visual panache that they brought to the video.
Yeah, absolutely. The new romantic bands very much had a very highly produced sound, and it was very much based on also the appearance. So you're not going to have a bunch of, mind you, the dude from Flock of Seagulls was quite ugly, but I'm saying like most,
guy, right?
mostly, mostly people are these, these like handsome dudes who be singing. And it's, the sophisticated British look. What was interesting about the New Romantics, and it went away and never really came back in quite the same way, is they had a retro that would go back to the pre-50s. So they'd have visuals from like the 20s, 30s, and 40s in terms of their dress. So you had like guys in Spandau Ballet with the long tailcoats on their blazer kind of thing. And so for a bit of time in the early 80s, you had this interesting retro look. And another factor is this is the rise of what we call synth pop, right?
Right.
So a lot of the music is like you would have bands, but there's not really this emphasis on the guitar, bass, and drums in quite the same way. Like I don't think about that when I think about Duran Duran. I think about this very highly produced music. And then there's artists where it's the keyboards, it's the programming. Yeah, right. Along with the singing is the emphasis there. So I always associate the mainstream 80s with this sort of embracement of the high-tech world. So, I mean, I was a kid who played video games in the early 80s. So, I mean, It does seem like there was an embracement of something high-tech, modern, urban that wasn't happening in quite the same way in the 70s.
Exactly. Yeah. In a way, the music of the 70s lost its way through disco music, which we'll mention a bit later on. And its response was to get glossier, but it enlivened itself with elements from the new wave. And for instance, suddenly you get someone like Madonna come along, and her first album, in fact, they didn't even put her on the cover of her first 12-inch single, which was Everybody or something like that, because they didn't want anyone to know she wasn't black. And then later, when you saw her album, her visual style was really coming from kind of a new wavy look, but commercialized. And you see a lot of this in the styles. For instance, we talk about the big hair and of the 80s and all of this, but that was all coming out of the New Romantics and various bands. So, for instance, you take someone like Robert Smith of The Cure. Now, my feeling is his album, Pornography, was so dark. My feeling was, okay, either you've got two roads to go here, Robert. Either A, you just say, okay, I admit it, my life is in shambles. I need something. Help me, Jesus. Or you end things. Instead, what we get is Love Cats.
Yes.
Which is ridiculously commercial song. And he starts becoming a commercial property, The Cure does, throughout the late 80s, which was very strange.
Well, I mean, it's interesting to see where these sort of more mainstream bands go, because you do have musicians there in that coming out of that new wave British scene that are actually quite good musicians. Like the guys from Tears for Fears can play instruments quite well. Mm-hmm. And, they've probably grown up on prog rock, and they're kind of incorporating elements of that into a very, very commercialized sound.
Right.
But it's not the same as listening to like the epic guitar solos of Jimmy Page in the 70s. Even though these are accomplished players, it's very much embedded in the slick production. So that's why there was other music going on where people wanted to get more kind of indulged in the musical paralysis of the players. There were very, I mean, we can go all over the place here, but there were very, very interesting phenomenon in the world of, say, like you talked about, like hard rock. Mm-hmm. So you had a very, very commercialized hard rock that comes in through the mid to late 70s. The band that really, I think, one of the bands that starts this trend is Boston. Now, Boston wasn't even a band. It was
Tom Scholz.
Tom Scholz, and he just this is one of the greatest produced albums ever, and he did it himself, and he put together this kind of a bunch of players, but he had just done the levels of the mixes were so like how many tracks he layered was unbelievable.
He made the album himself and then found some players who could.
Yeah. And exactly. But so they had these bands, and then you get like the Foreigner and the Journey, and they're taking a pop element, embedding it into the rock, and they're taking the sort of dangerous elements of the rock, the rougher edges out. Right. So that stuff goes right into the 80s, and you have the prog rock players coming back and following that format. So you mentioned Genesis for sure, and Yes, when they did Owner of a Lonely Heart, and then there was this super group called Asia, same thing.
Yeah.
Where you have this embedded sound. Then you do get some heavier elements where there was an emphasis on the musicianship. The band that brings that in is Van Halen. So Van Halen 1 is just such a killer rock album, but it's this guy playing this super fast guitar, this finger tapping style that no one's ever heard, that starts this second wave of the guitar heroes. The guitarist for Ozzy Osbourne, Randy Rhoads, is in the same ilk, classically trained guy. He's just doing these incredible fast scales. And so that became sort of the new outlet for people who wanted the musicianship. You would have this in metal, and you'd have it in things like jazz.
I remember all of these bands, Yngwie Malmsteen, and there was this girl, I think her name was Kat, who was like also like one of these people who was...
Yeah, Jennifer Batten was one as well. And Joe Satriani, Steve Vai, Yngwie Malmsteen. We used to call the people... You give out like Guitar World magazine, you'd see these albums for just these kind of bands where it's like us musical wanking, and they would call the people who like this kind of music poodle-haired guitar techs. They'd always have this big kind of poodle-haired, and they'd be obsessed with how clean and how fast and how good the musicianship was.
Yeah.
So there was that, and that was definitely not underground, but it wasn't like in mainstream, but it definitely had that clean production and everything.
Well, why don't you, for my benefit as well as everyone else's, detail to the degree you can the steps from this kind of music into the hair metal bands?
Okay, well, hair metal's a little bit different. Hair metal was adjacent to that, of course, because you always have a guitar lead. So what you have with hair metal is you have these musical scenes that are coming out of Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. And there's a bunch of bands down there. And the visuals that they're taking from is from the original glam bands and the stuff like the New York Dolls. So they're taking those outrageous visuals. Now, what's interesting here is that these guys are wearing spandex. Right. They're wearing the cheesiest colors, but they're very much like kind of masculine dudes who are, like getting up to all kinds of things with women. So it's not really the same kind of androgyny that you would see in other music scenes, but they do have, we're wearing glitter and makeup and lipstick. So one band that was kind of a precursor to this is out of Finland called Hanoi Rocks. Mm-hmm. And
what was that again?
Hanoi Rocks out of Finland with Michael Monroe. One of the members got accidentally killed in a car accident with Vince Neil and Motley Crue. So yeah, you start getting these bands. The first band to sort of break was Quiet Riot, and they had they actually covered the Slade song "Come On, Feel the Noise." Yeah, and that became a big hit for them. But you've got this clean production, and then you have a heavier kind of sleazier band called Motley Crue,
Right.
who were, really excessive, but they were kind of like, they were kind of rough around their edges, especially on those first two albums, which I actually quite like. And so they represent that sort of sleaziness, but there became this whole massive scene within this hair metal, and people are all moving to LA, and it's all based on sort of the visuals. And yeah, you do have some of that like finger tapping guitar solos and stuff, and it became a very a serious format to it. Right. The band that pushes it to the most pop element is a band called Poison. So Poison was definitely the most commercial pop element, and a huge amount of the audience is female, and the girls would, dress up in very suggestive ways when they go to these concerts, and it was a huge female audience, which of course we could talk about later what else is happening in metal as a sort of counter reaction to that.
And later when we get to the underground metal scenes, we'll come back.
But the band that sort of says, okay, let's have that sound, but let's bring a bit of a street edge back to it, and it ended up being the most successful band of the 80s was Guns N' Roses. Yeah, so Guns N' Roses to say we're going to be kind of like that, but we're going to be a little tougher so the guys can like us as well. And there's lots of these. We kind of bring back the 70s rock guitar lead sound with what Slash did. So that kind of wraps up where hair metal was.
Yeah. And there was a slight connection to like the Deadheads. For instance, with someone like Guns N' Roses, they're using the kind of skull imagery of the Grateful Dead. They're using the artists. Robert Williams, who's kind of connected to that scene. And it's only at the end of the 80s that you have this Deadhead revival. Although I think that connects also with a lot of the alternative stuff of the 90s.
Yeah, so there's two things there. I think with the whole thing with Guns N' Roses and that Deadhead connection in terms of the visual ads, or the visual imagery that you would find on the T-shirts and stuff, that was there with a whole wide range of music. But you bring up an interesting point. The T-shirt and the T-shirt sales became a huge factor at rock concerts than they had been in the 70s.
Right.
And I actually remember one look from and we could always tell like the tough kids at our school, they had these style T-shirts. In the early 80s, they would have these metal T-shirts with like, it'd be black with a white sleeve that wouldn't fully go down to the wrist, or maybe stop halfway through the forearm. And you'd see like Aussie shirts like this. Eventually you get like the Jacksons had a shirt like this, but these were like your concert T-shirts.
Right.
And so you could go, I remember looking through like racks of T-shirts then, and you'd have Megadeth, Grateful Dead, Guns N' Roses, like you'd have a variety thing. But I think with what they have there is that visual was now a big deal, and the T-shirt sales became such a massive component for the concerts and also for the identity. You walk around with a certain T-shirt, this is who I'm, this is the identity I have. But we'll get to that in a minute.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, is that we see in the 80s the rise of merch, the rise of record sales and CD sales now were very strong. And so you have something like, and we might as well mention him now, Michael Jackson.
Yes.
And who is the star of the 80s.
Yes.
And sold, 50 million copies of Thriller in the first couple of years there? Absolutely astounding. And he's coming out of the R&B disco world, essentially. But he also does things like has rock guitarists who will play behind him. Quincy Jones is producing, and very savvy when it comes to what to add and where. And I don't know if you know Tina Marie. She had this one album where she had Stevie Ray Vaughan playing behind her, a similar kind of neo R&B style, which I kind of like that combination of stuff.
It's so interesting because there's two artists that are just. I mean, Michael Jackson was beyond phenomenal. One of my first tapes was my sister said she wore a bunch of sunglasses when she went into the record store to buy the Thriller tape for me, so no one would know it was her. She was so embarrassed because she was more into the British New Wave bits. Yeah, so she bought me the Thriller tape. I got it one Christmas, and I remember playing that tape to death. But the other thing was like how big Thriller was. I don't think. I mean, I don't really keep track of what's happening with Taylor Swift or these things now, but I don't ever remember anything being that culturally huge as how big Thriller was.
Well, the thing about Taylor Swift in the current era is that she's very good at managing her fans. The difference is Michael Jackson just didn't have his fans. He had the world.
Yeah, it was so beyond massive how big Michael Jackson was. But I remember even there were like massive divisions in music. And I remember that even maybe a year after I liked Michael Jackson, when I started getting to rock, I'd be like, I hated Michael Jackson. And everyone I knew kind of hated Michael Jackson by that point. So this grotesque commerciality, I'm not even talking underground here. I'm like talking people who just like rock music now.
Right, exactly.
There was a huge, no, we don't like the commerciality of Michael Jackson. And it was interesting how much time like it took between what was Thriller's, what is Thriller 82? Is it 82?
Yeah, right around there.
Yeah, but it's 87 is when Bad comes out.
Right.
And of course, I couldn't stand Michael Jackson by that point. But it does how big it was. I've never seen a phenomenon, but how much time it took for him to come up with that next album. That's a massive gap in time.
Yeah. Well, being older than you, my take on Michael Jackson, much like my take on Star Wars, was very different. And so, for instance, I remember asking people, what do you hear in him? And they say, he's so intense, and the way he dances, and his little, kind of vocalizations and stuff. And I thought, like, okay, there's a very interesting clip of James Brown in the 70s, in the early 80s, and Michael Jackson is in his audience, and he calls Michael Jackson up, and Michael Jackson comes up and does his moves precisely.
Yeah.
Brown loves it because it's like he's passing on the baton. But the difference is, of course, nobody outside of the black world understood James Brown very much, especially during the late 60s, early 70s, of just the audience with Michael Jackson. But it's something that Michael Jackson is often looked at as the person who kind of opened up MTV to all manner of black voices.
Yeah, they didn't play black artists
prior to that because they were looking at themselves as basically being a TV channel that people in the Midwest or Ontario,
yes. Yes, that's quite true. And yeah, I remember they said they once Michael Jackson came through, there was a lot more black artists on MTV and just in the video rotations. So that's where the commercialization was happening. Commercialization and the clean production is happening ubiquitously everywhere.
Yeah. Well, for me, one of the big moments that I felt was a turning point in the 80s, for me, the most important Bruce Springsteen song album was Nebraska. And I felt he hit some sort of core of who he was. His next album was Born in the USA. And at that point, he himself said, well, I wanted to do something for my band to give them something basically to retire on. And so he starts adding all of these new elements to the music, synth sounds, more variations on remixes on 12 inches that could be played in a club and all this. And of course, that album sold like wild. And Bruce Springsteen went from friends who saw him in the 70s playing at the Bottom Line in New York. It was just a small club, you get a couple hundred people in there. But by the end of the 70s, he was seen as like Mr. New Jersey. By the end of Nebraska album, he was Mr. America. And by the end of that, he was like, he's suddenly taken on this whole mantle, which I felt was a bit artificial, of him being this, ambassador of American culture to the world. And I think that to me summarized what happened in the overground culture, the mainstream culture of the 80s. So many of the bands from the 70s had to commercialize themselves. So whether it's David Bowie with Let's Dance and the Serious Moonlight Tour and whatnot, or Serious Midnight. Anyway, or whether it's what happened with Genesis and Yes and those bands, or whether it's I remember one of my favorite country artists from the '70s was Emmylou Harris, always very pure and authentic, and I saw her play in the early '80s, and she was wonderful, but by the end of the '80s, she's got synth drums.
Yeah,
I'm going like, what is going on?
Yeah,
which is one of the reasons why the music had to change in the '90s.
For sure. And, it's very funny because just a quick thing on Bruce Springsteen is that was Born in the USA. I actually had that tape when I was a kid. Mm-hmm. And it was that was my first impression of Bruce Springsteen.
Right.
But then once I got into rock, I thought, this stuff's garbage. And I thought Bruce Springsteen was just bad. And that was the essence of Bruce Springsteen until later when I rediscovered Nebraska and some of these earlier things. I go, oh, this guy actually is a really good songwriter. Because my impression was him, like Born in the USA. I thought that was just some patriotic anthem because I'd see like pro wrestlers come into Born in the USA. But then I read the lyrics. I'm like, no, that's actually a much more complicated song. But that was the impression we were getting in the mainstreaming of everything. And I think it's just that instantaneous product that's being sold in the video. You can't have that same level of depth, right? But one final point of video. One thing that was cool though is that when I watch old videos from the early 80s, they were very creative. They were a lot more low budget and they were a lot more creative than the stuff that would come later on. The later on stuff would be way more formulaic, but some of the early 80s videos were actually quite interesting in their crudeness. Like you see like some film art student just creating something and it was kind of interesting, but and I remember just by the end of the 80s where you talk about the Deadheads and stuff like that, I wasn't really a Deadhead, but I definitely got into older rock because of how much the music seemed so bad in the 80s. And once I heard the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, this stuff, I thought this stuff's so good. Why don't we have music like this now? And that's why, and I knew a lot of people like that. People went back and were just listening to the older albums from the 60s and 70s at that time. So there was a backlash that was happening before anyway.
Right. Interestingly enough, the Deadhead thing then produced, and we probably won't talk about this later, it produced this jam band culture with bands like Fish and whatnot. And then you have the Dave Matthews Band and Hootie and the Blowfish and all these bands, which were very commercial, kind of college cool sort of band.
Spin Doctors, that kind of stuff.
That's interesting. But that's all, to me, pretty mainstream stuff.
Oh, very much so. So
let's dip down.
So this is why I want to.
Other aspect, there was this post-disco culture, which was still had hits in the early 80s, and eventually the part of it kind of dips down below the surface, and it goes off into clubs in Detroit and in the UK, and eventually kind of surfaces again as what they call house music, and then techno music, and then electronica in the 90s. But to me, there's something about that music which had a lot of similarities to the synth pop of the early half of
For sure.
To me, they're all kind of a continuum. The difference is a lot of this electronic music was more faceless. And I think it continued that way all the way to the end of the century and further on.
Yes, for sure. If we're going to dip down into the underground, I think...
let's go back to the beginning of the 80s.
I got to talk about...
Go ahead.
We kind of quickly talked about something here. There's going to be two things I'm going to talk about that'll eventually collide into each other. Okay. So one is, one of the greatest years for music for me is 1979, but it's not the mainstream. It is what we call the British post-punk. There are so many incredible bands and albums in that year alone.
Right.
Gang of Fours, Entertainment, Wire, who literally went from the Ramones to Pink Floyd in 3 albums with their album 154. It's so futuristic sounding. Yeah, of course, The Fall, who I could go on about forever. There's also
XTC. You had Paris. You had
Paris. Yep. You have Swell Maps, who are
primitivist bands like the Slits and the Raincoats and all of this sort of thing. They were all part of one similar attitude.
There's like the Ruts, the Swell Maps are doing like a garage version of Can. Like there's all kinds of great stuff. So in that late 70s, early 80s, you get this incredible diversity of guitar rock coming out of the UK. Now, eventually, a lot of that stuff either kind of fades out or it gets taken over by the synth pop stuff. Though some does still remain. Those few years would have a huge impact on another scene. So the other scene is that when you had that big push for British punk from, say, like 77 to about 79, it never really took off in America. But people still liked, there was a scene of people who liked that music and who were imitating that music.
Right.
And a lot of these guys, very primitive musicianship, not all though, some were very technically competent. They would take the music and they would keep trying to speed it up. So the first album to really do this is out of a California band called Middle Class. And then there's an EP called Out of Vogue, and it gets really, really fast. Greg Ginn forms Black Flag. They have the Nervous Breakdown EP. I believe that's also 1978 as well. There's the most interesting band is this band out of DC who are a bunch of black Rastafarians called the Bad Brains. These guys are actually a jazz fusion band. So these guys can play their instrument and they create this breakneck speed, intense version of punk.
Right.
And they have fans that are watching this in DC, and there's a guy named Ian Mackay who forms a band called Minor Threat. Even another band called Teen Idols. Henry Rollins comes out of there as well. They're doing the separation between we're punk, but we're not into like the Go-Go's or the B-52s. We're hardcore punk. We're hardcore about this. And you get this underground scene, which people are playing very breakneck speed music that is very intense. There's a lot of like slam dancing, fighting at shows. It's really, really intense. But these scenes are like spreading out everywhere. And it's so completely underground.
Different cities in America, like Minneapolis or Lawrence, Kansas, or Seattle becomes very place.
San Francisco, Detroit, there's all over the place. There's all these different scenes that are spreading up. There is an interesting scene version of that happening in the UK as well, with what we'll call like UK 82, with bands like Discharge, The Exploited, and those kinds of bands as well. They're kind of more post-apocalyptic sounding. Right. But all of America, you have all these bands. But even right from the beginning, there were bands in those scenes that were saying, I just don't want to be so formulaic. So a couple of examples I have is there's this noisy band out of San Francisco called Flipper who said, everyone wants to play fast. We're going to play slow. This might be one of the ultimate precursors to grunge. So they start playing really, really slow and being noisy. There's a band called the Minutemen out of LA who, again, are starting to incorporate jazz, funk, folk music, but it's that short hardcore punk sound, and you've got this whole variety of stuff. These guys are influenced by the British post-punks and that experiment that took on here, and that's going to start embedding into an underground.
Well,
go ahead.
What happened was, I remember in New York City, we had enough people who supported alternative or this post-punk world to keep the record stores going. Mm-hmm. But when you do the actual numbers, there weren't that many. However, I started noticing that there were new bands coming out all the time. So I remember seeing all these, 45s and albums and stuff. Just there was like a flood starting to spread, and that's fascinating. Also, there was a time when it seemed like every friend I knew in New York City, they would have something in their head that they're listening to on their Walkman. I said, "What are you listening to?" And it would always be the Butthole Surfers.
Yes. So that's another band out of Texas that was adjacent to the hardcore punk sound. There was actually a lot of cool bands out of Texas, like the Big Boys and others, that they created their own sound that was definitely noisy, very experimental. You can't really call it like hardcore punk. It's something different. It's infected by a hippie aesthetic, but it's like completely twisted. Right. But yeah, so you're having this growth of not just punk. So people maybe started out as hardcore punk bands, but they're hearing the British post-punk, and there's other kinds of music developing. So there's this like stew of different types of sounds that are happening in the underground. Now, some of these are a bit more palatable, and one of the most palatable of them would have been out of Athens, Georgia, and that would have been REM, right? And then out of Minneapolis, you get Husker Du starts incorporating more melody. And there's a band that starts out as a really sloppy punk band, but gets infected by like Big Star and the Faces and bands like that. And that's the Replacements. Mm-hmm. And they become, they're very melodic. So you get this sort of what you get from the development of here out of the hardcore punk, you get something college radio, right? College rock. I
think the first use of the word alternative was applied to Camper Van Beethoven in the second half of the 80s.
Yeah, and those types of bands that are very melodic, they're intelligent. There's definitely a sense of that irony. You start embedding the postmodern irony you talk about. But this isn't like the blur of noise that hardcore punk was. But
they're halfway between the mainstream and the underground.
Yeah, and they're sometimes bumping their heads on the ceiling of the mainstream. But what happens is there's all kinds of other stuff that starts to develop. So you were in New York, and there starts to be all these bands that are working with real noise. Like, what do we do with the guitar amp and just the sonics of it? Exemplified by two bands, Sonic Youth and the Swans, whose name sounds like a pleasant animal, and they're just brutal. Right. So you have all this stuff developing here. And again, this is all in the underground. Now, that hardcore punk was also being listened to by metal guys. So the metal people are hearing hardcore punk. And
Before we go to the metal connection, let me just point out one thing. Yeah. There was, what I noticed in New York City happening was there was a division occurring. And we'll get to this when you talk about the metal guys, but also when we come back to the rediscovery of Black Sabbath, is that in New York City, there was starting to be a difference between the hardcore punks who liked just one fast speed, basically, and the people who were pushing this other edge, which was basically leading us to the 90s.
Yeah. Oh, yes. So the album that creates this challenge is an album, I think it's 1984's My War by Black Flag. Mm-hmm. They are incorporating Black Sabbath, and they create this sludgy, heavy, dark sound. And people didn't know how to take it. And when they come on stage, they've been, nobody's cut their hair for 2 years. So everyone's got long hair. So they look like these hippies. They're supposed to be the most uncool thing by about 1984, especially in the mainstream. And you're getting this hostility from like the punks and skinheads in the audience.
Serious hostility.
Oh, and Rollins would take them on, and but it's interesting. But that sound would infect the whole rest of the 80s into the 90s.
Right.
And they start having these crazy jazz fusion influence kind of sounds too. Like they really go all over the place, Black Flag. It's still got a nihilistic edge to it, but they're creating something very, very different musically.
Right. Well, it's no longer uniform punk or uniform hardcore.
Yeah.
It is now this kind of amorphous thing. I mean, Butthole Surfers, what category are they in?
Yeah.
Flipper, what category really are they in? And some of this stuff is leaking up towards the Pacific Northwest. We'll discuss that in a moment.
Yep.
But there's these different scenes. And I think what's really important about the 80s underground is the creation of scenes, but also there's a creation of different tribes.
Yeah, for sure.
Ska and garage punks and hardcore, and then whatever this other stuff is mutating in the corner.
Right. So there's so much to go into there. So yeah, you're absolutely right. This underground starts developing into various scenes. I noticed there was always a difference though between the musicians and their fans. So their fans would often be very, very tribal, but the musicians who are actually playing the music might actually listen to a variety of genres, and this is often the case. But yeah, you're right. There were all these different, like people playing garage rock revival, ska revival, all these different sorts of scenes, pop punk from California.
Here's the thing, my friend told me, his name is Greg, and he was in the Toasters, which was like a neo-ska band in between the British scene and the later 90s American scene.
Yeah.
And they were in New York City, and there was a British guy, Rob Hingley, who went by the name of Bucket, who was the guy behind keeping this weird ska scene alive in New York City. And my friend Greg said that he did a national tour with them, and on the East Coast, you'd find a real mixture of black and white folks in the audience. But he said by the time we got to the West Coast, it was all just white people, and you started getting a lot of the neo N-words in there, and the word isn't a racial epithet, it's a racial, shall we say, designation. You know? So that was very strange, that the country would be one way in one place and another way in the other.
Yeah, and that's why a lot of people, there was all kinds of musical scenes that changed. So I remember Ian Mackay breaking up Minor Threat because of the violence at the shows, and he said, I'm out. And he starts experimenting. He has bands like Egg Hunt and Embrace, and eventually there'll be Fugazi coming out of that too, but they're still keeping that very much that underground ethic.
Right.
So there's that scene, there's all these scenes, but again, all these things are kind of operating at the same time. And what happened was out of LA, there's these bands that are hearing the hardcore punk, but these guys are playing metal. They like the British new wave of heavy metal, but they're hearing the American and British hardcore punk, and they're liking the aggression of it. So they will form bands like Slayer and Metallica. Metallica actually move up to San Francisco, and that creates a whole new scene. Now, there were other scenes in New York. So what's interesting, what you said about the hardcore punk people in New York would be people who lived in the city, and the people who were in the suburbs were playing thrash metal, bands like Anthrax and Overkill. So you get this development of a whole scene called thrash metal. So thrash metal is intense metal, high octane. You've got those crazy lead guitar solos influenced by the Guitar Heroes of Eddie Van Halen, but it's a loud aggression. It's fast, and metal will go in this direction. So this idea that the people who are the true metalheads will be into this intense music that's extremely challenging. This is the polar opposite to that hair metal, right? So there's scenes about, even beginning, Metallica's James Hetfield calling them fake people, and stuff like that.
What do you know about how the thrash metalers and the ones who are, the speed metal and stuff, how they related to the hair metal types?
Oh, they hated them.
Yeah.
They hated them. I mean, most of the time, I think there probably would be guys who were into Metallica who the girlfriend might like hair metal, but generally it was like, those guys are the posers. They're not into the real metal. We're into the real metal, right? Those are the fake people.
Right.
So, yeah, it was often very, very kind of scummy and extreme. I remember seeing Slayer in 1991, and that's where I think my tinnitus started. It was so loud.
Right.
But what then starts to happen is so these are guys who also liked hardcore punk, but they're playing this incredible intense metal. The hardcore punk people start hearing this and going, oh, wow, this is actually kind of cool. And they create something called crossover thrash. So bands that previously played hardcore like COC and DRI, and there were this other band called the Cro-Mags. They would embrace that thrash metal and bring that intensity in. So it started being a big crossover. Now, at first, these audiences, it was apparently bad. So you'd have the metal people and you'd have the skinheads and the punks, and they'd all start fighting.
Right.
A band like Suicidal Tendencies would be a West Coast version of that. So, but eventually everything kind of peace was by the end of the 80s, it was peaceful in a sense. There were still thrash metal shows, but they weren't having those like gang violence that was very much early on. But so, and then that scene, by the end of the 80s, some of those thrash metal bands are really experimenting as well. They're experimenting with all kinds of time signatures. And there's this great band out of Quebec called Voivod, who are like doing a thrash metal version of like prog rock kind of influence stuff. It was really cool. So there's that whole tapestry. Then there's two other things that happen. In Europe, very much in the early 80s, you got this very extreme metal scene some of it was pre-thrash metal, and they were really quite intense. And this would be what's called the first wave of black metal. So you get bands, and it's named after an album by this band called Venom out of the UK. But there'd be bands like Hellhammer, Celtic Frost, Bathory out of Sweden, and it kind of had a more of a tinny sound. That influence will end up in all places, sunny Tampa, Florida. In sunny Tampa, Florida, you get the rise of death metal. And so even thrash metal sometimes would have a bit of a melody to it. Right? When you get to death metal, they're just going, ooh, like it's like guttural, right? And you get these bands like one called Death, Morbid Angel, Obituary, and this is the most extreme metal out of sunny Tampa, California, with the playing with blatant satanic imagery and stuff. But it was such a unique underground scene. Like if those bands came to Toronto, all the metal guys would just go right to the show. Like, this is incredible. So yeah, I kind of went all over the place, but as you see, there's this tapestry of this underground music.
Also this whole goth and industrial fringe that was happening. But what's interesting is as the decade is wearing on, they're very tribal at the beginning of the decade and in the middle, but somewhere around 88, 89, they start getting closer, and all these things start getting closer and closer, and you start getting really strange connections between them all, which is going to come up. All these different scenes, all these different tribes, in a sense, are going to come up in the 90s. I mean, we often say Nirvana Smells Like Teen Spirits was what did it, and I think it is. But before that, you had Sonic Youth, you had Faith No More, you had other bands that were kind of along that lineage who were suddenly being signed to the majors. And
the band I would say that is the most important as the precursor to Nirvana, and the sound is actually very different, is Jane's Addiction. So Jane's Addiction, they play it. It's very much it embraces those things like the goth subculture and the kind of nihilism, but they're very much indebted to Led Zeppelin in their sound, and it's a thick rock sound that's huge, but it's got this underground following. And I actually never attended it, but my friends did, and people said I'm almost into the 90s now, we're in the 90s now, but the first Lollapalooza was the most interesting one, because there hadn't been a Nirvana breakthrough yet. So you really had a set of who was all in the underground. It was very mixed up. That was actually cool. Yeah. So yeah, you do have these things. I did a video on the alternative metal bands. Yeah, you do get things like Jane's Addiction, Faith No More, the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Mother's Milk. That was taken. Yeah, that took
kind of post-punky, funky, rappy thing into being, give it away now,
Yeah, but even before that, they embraced the thickness of thrash metal in the Mother's Milk album. So yeah, they definitely they came into the mainstream huge. There were interesting bands like Fishbone as well, doing their own thing. So there's all this stuff bubbling on the surface. Now I have an interesting story. I don't know if I told it to you before, but I had bought the debut album. I think it's from '89, late '89, of Soundgarden's Louder Than Love. And I was going on a trip to the United States. I think it was Cedar Point, this amusement park, and I was playing
on the roller coaster.
Yeah, I went on the roller coaster. I went with my friend's family. It was pretty cool. But anyway, I was playing the tape in the car, and people thought, this sounds like, cats being tortured. This is terrible. Then a year or two later, they would be listening to the Bad Motorfinger album, all of them. And so it's just funny. I think a lot of people sometimes need permission to like things, and then they decide to like things.
The music that was on the radio, the mainstream radio in like 87, 88 was so horrifying.
Oh,
and
it was the most...
And that when you heard something like a Faith No More, their epic song, or Sonic Youth, what was that song that they had that was kind of a hit?
Cool Thing?
Yeah. When you would hear those, they would really pop out at you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure.
5 years later.
Yeah. I mean, we were just inundated with all this crap all the time in the late 80s. I mean, again, so first I was into the old rock, and then I got into the underground rock, but we were like looking, can we have some good, because eventually the old rock kind of ran out because it's like, I want to discover something new. There were a couple of interesting concerts that happened then. Well, there's one in particular, and a guy who kind of has a bit more of his ear to the underground was Neil Young. And he did a tour in 90 or 91 where he had Social Distortion and Sonic Youth open. Mm-hmm. Now, the fans didn't appreciate the bands as much, especially Sonic Youth really pushed their limits. But he was obviously into this stuff, and he had an awareness. These are interesting bands.
Back in, I think it was around 79, he did his Rust Never Sleeps tour, and they made a movie of that, which is quite interesting. And it's Neil Young basically just smashing out his very sparse chords in total distortion. Solidarity with the punks.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. And it's massively influential. Right. So we get this scene developing out of Seattle. I'll briefly talk about that.
Go ahead.
There was a bunch of cool bands out of there from mid 80s onward. Now they're getting influenced by. They were definitely influenced by Black Flag. There was a band out of Portland called the Wipers, really, really interesting rock band, which was, they were punk, but they're taking elements of like Jimi Hendrix and all kinds of interesting rhythms. They were quite influential. So you get bands like coming out of Seattle, you get Skin Yard, you get Green River, right, which had members of both Mudhoney and later Pearl Jam. But this scene even would be not necessarily one scene. So you do have bands that are a bit more into the punk thing, but you have also bands that were into more of a rock sound. So a couple of those bands are Alice in Chains. Alice in Chains definitely comes out of a metal rock sound. And the other one is Mother Love Bone, and they have a singer called Andrew Wood. He ODs on heroin. Most of those members then go on to form Pearl Jam.
Right.
Even from the beginning, there was that divide between people who were more in the rock thing and then people who were more kind of from the punk thing.
Right.
Okay. So from there, I remember reading an interview in a magazine for Soundgarden because I liked them about 1990, and it had this Chris Cornell with a Nirvana shirt. I had no idea who Nirvana was. It said, the caption said, "Yes, Chris, we're all in Nirvana now." Some cheesy thing.
Right.
I had heard about when they list different bands from Seattle, Nirvana would be one of many. Then I eventually see this song, Smells Like Teen Spirit. I instantly knew this is going to be huge. I don't know how I knew it. I just felt it. Because we had been listening to all this underground stuff. The Lollapalooza stuff had done in 91. But this thing, and I have never seen up close a cultural transformation in the same way. The people who have been listening to house music, the people listening to hair metal, everything changed. Right. Everyone got the ankle Doc Martens. Everything changed. And then this flood of stuff came in. And that's what probably caused me to go deeper into underground music and stuff, right?
Part of it is also Nirvana was influenced very clearly by people like the Pixies.
Oh, and yes, that was another one.
Soft dynamic, and he totally found that and said, "Ooh, I like that." And so what that did is it pointed a lot of people back at the immediate underground scenes of the 80s.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. And there were bands that were like on the verge of being something like Nirvana. One of them was Dinosaur Jr. They had that melody and distorted guitar. And yeah, like the Pixies. But none of these bands broke through. And there's this book, I think it's called like The Road to 666, about why Nirvana was the band that broke through and not these other ones. And it's very interesting to see what happened. So then you get, right from the beginning, you get also the rise of Pearl Jam. Pearl Jam is a much more palatable band to the mainstream than Nirvana. Mm-hmm. I remember seeing Pearl Jam in concert back in 92, very early. It was standing room only concert hall. It wasn't like a massive stadium. But how big they became, I mean, people were like, Eddie Vedder's going to save the world. I'd be talking to people like that, and these people going, man, this music's deep. I'm like, do you know anything about underground music at all? But anyway.
Well, the thing about Pearl Jam is they became, in a sense, the commercial template for a lot of other alternative bands after them.
You can do a straight line between Pearl Jam all the way to Nickelback.
Exactly.
I mean, how it just goes and descends like that, it's unbelievable. But anyway,
bands who tried to imitate Nirvana, but the truth is, without Kurt Cobain, it's really hard to do.
No, it is, and you tried to have these Nirvana wannabes, even visually. The worst of those being Silverchair out of Australia. Right. But yeah, no, having the integrity of that kind of musician. So you have a few years where alternative music, underground music, is definitely more hip. It's more acceptable.
Yeah, I would say like 90 through 93 is kind of like the golden age.
Yeah, I'd say 93, 94.
One of the interesting things is how many different kinds of people. So we're talking about eras here, not just styles. So you had, for instance, a group like Helmet, who came out of my friend's band of Susans, who is along with Sonic Youth. Now, they were part of the noise scene in New York, but Helmet is this new kind of weird metal thing. Later, they would do something. Another big thing from this period is gangster rap. Comes from this era. And gangster rap is trying, there was a rap kind of slowly comes out of the South Bronx throughout the 80s, spreads to different scenes. You eventually get big acts like Run DMC, and you get the Beastie Boys and stuff, but then you start to get the commercializations of it, Vanilla Ice, MC Hammer.
Yeah.
But suddenly this new gangster rap thing brings up this kind of menacing element of, life in the hood. But then you get this album called Judgment Day, which was from the soundtrack of the
Judgment Night soundtrack. Yeah.
Night, thank you. Of the, and you get all of these weird metal and alternative bands.
Yeah. I remember that.
Hip hop, gangster rap type things, and some amazing music coming out of there, which was a foreshadow of the later decades, kind of more decadent new metal scene.
Yeah. So and there's one other factor, and I can't remember what's this called. One of the things that changed the whole music industry prior to Nirvana, just maybe a year prior, there was what was that system when you they had a way of actually monitoring the sales directly. What was it called? SoundScan. That was it. So all of a sudden,
so if you went to Tower Records, see, I worked in the music biz in the early 80s, and the way that the charts were made was they were made based on how many boxes of albums were sold to different stores and chains and such. But here's the weird thing about that. This is a very interesting bit of bootlegiana. In 1979, you had this 78, 79, 78, I think it was Saturday Night Fever came out. And so they sold
I think 77 Saturday Night Fever. I think 70.
They sold this and it was a big hit, but then the bootleggers figured out, if we bootleg stuff like this, we can sell it. So the next year or so, they put out the Sgt. Pepper movie soundtrack, which had the Beach Boys, the Bee Gees, and Peter Frampton, and Elton John, and all these people. So they shipped it #1 at 1 million copies. The way it would work is later, 6 weeks, 2 months, 3 months later, they would say, okay, you can ship us back what you didn't sell us, and we'll remainder it. They got more than 1 million copies back.
Oh, well, that album did not age well, but
no, it didn't. It aged like really bad milk, but and it didn't turn into cheese. Well, it kind of did turn into cheese, didn't it?
Maybe cheese,
But yeah. So by the end of the 80s, I think it was the week that the SoundScan came into Tower Records and these other places. You know who the #1 artist was suddenly? Garth Brooks.
Yeah.
And everyone was like, huh? How did country music, no one was paying attention to it. But that's what SoundScan did, is it changed the way things were actually.
People realized that Slayer and NWA were big sellers at that point. Record companies did, because they're like, whoa, these are actually moving a lot of units. In a way, like, we're always getting that sort of more palatable music, but people actually do want to hear the gangster rap. They want to hear the thrash metal.
Yeah.
And that's why it's interesting. Metallica breaking through in '91 was such a huge deal, I remember at first I kind of embraced it, but then I remember after a few months, I'm like, this is really a sellout. I mean, I remember going to the Metallica concert and all the popular girls from my school were there. I'm like, what? 2 years ago, if we came up to you and said Metallica, you'd be going, ooh, and now you're at the concert. It's like,
yeah.
okay.
Well, they were also doing power ballads now.
Yeah, yeah.
And but you know, it was an interesting time. The first half of the '90s, I think, was very interesting. I think Kurt Cobain's death really put the kibosh on everything, and suddenly you had this pop punk scene explode.
Yes.
But also in the college rock underground alternative circuits, you suddenly had bands that were noisy, but in this kind of drifty, floaty post rock sort of way.
Yeah, for sure.
And that became a very, you had bands like Low and Tortoise and all of this stuff that went on through the end of the 80s. They never became huge mainstream hits.
Yeah.
But essentially what they did is they said, we don't want to be the guys taking off their shirts and singing this pumped up stuff. We don't want to be, what these Seattle bands became.
Yeah, that's true. And there all started to be kind of divisions too, because there was I got to know people in sort of what was called the hardcore punk scene in the 90s, but they weren't really playing what I was thinking of as hardcore punk. They're playing like a kind of almost extreme grindcore noise, almost death metal-y sounding music.
Right.
And they would just be like going, and that would be, but it'd be a hardcore, we're all vegan straight edge, and we sound like this. And there were all these like really underground records. And there was this record label out of Cleveland called Victory, where they played this heavy, intense, what would be called later metalcore, where there's lots of chugging and screaming. And that would be your shirts off, tons of tattoos, and lots of male violence sort of sound.
Yeah. What's also interesting around that period is you started getting more fragmentation again. So you had a neo.
Yeah.
Now we're talking about the new mainstream, which at this point was, pop punk, neo ska, neo swing, which was out of left field. You also had a weird kind of Latin push with stuff like Macarena and
yeah. I remember all that.
Or whatever. You had these different things came up, and this was like polite, fun music again. And
I think that had always been there. I mean, you got to understand, not everyone's listening to these things.
No.
That we are talking about, and a lot of people aren't. And so there's actually, I mean, when I went to university, a lot of the people in the communities around there would be people who would drive to the university and drive home. They'd have big cars and they'd be playing "Baby Don't Hurt Me" at like top volume. Like you'd hear all this kind of like kind of cheap. I like to move it, like this really cheap music. And I think that's why I am so prejudiced against any kind of electronic dance music. I think because of my impression of this.
Also, pretty much the biggest star of the 90s was Mariah Carey.
Yeah, exactly. People
this narrative at all. But essentially what happens is you have this commercialized R&B music. Now, who's listening to all this new alternative grunge noise, whatever? Well, it's not the people in the hood. And they're not also listening to all the gangster rap either.
No, there's all this other stuff that's happening there, and then you get some bands that embrace that sort of gangster vibe, but then want to do a rock thing on it. So some of them were kind of interesting. Like Korn at the beginning was kind of interesting, and the other band I kind of liked from that sound, actually like. Their album is Deftones. Their album White Pony. I actually think they were very creative. But the something exemplified by best by Limp Bizkit or Kid Rock.
Now we're heading towards the new metal territory.
Yeah, and this was okay. Here's the thing. I used to hate on hair metal so much. But at least hair metal had come from a kind of its own subculture, and during the tribe time of the 80s sort of was its own subculture.
Right.
There's two music scenes that I thought were just atrocious in the 90s. Pearl Jam were great. I can even semi-stomach Stone Temple Pilots to a degree. But after that, where every band has what's called the Jarl, we talked about this before, everyone's going, right?
And so I would seek to basically censor some of these people. so we could get back to some other shit and maybe get some real jazz and some real R&B and some real soul and some real rock and roll and all the other groovy stuff too, but just less of the dairy freeze. Here's your CD. Here's your CD. Because if you listen to like modern rock radio, you'll hear like 6 songs, one after the other, and they all sound like about the first half of a really boring, mediocre CD. When you find out it's 6 different bands, that's what's really bad, because Pro Tools and vocal pitching has made all these bands sound the same, and they all seem to utilize the same singer, who does that, yeah, hell yeah, yeah, and you can never tell what they say in the verse. It's like, oh, my nana, so messy, yeah, yeah, like, what the fuck? Is that the Creed bitch or the Days of the New Guy? And it's just like, yeah, 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 and these guys step down on a power chord, it's like, what the fuck happened, you guys? Where's the balls? I mean, are these people born with that testosterone? I mean,
So it's just because it's so formulaic. I respect hair metal more than that. And then with new metal, it was thicker yet cleaner. You know what I mean? Like the whole they have these thick, clean, and it's very produced music.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of the worst aspects of mall consumerism.
Right. Well, it's very much one of those neo things at the end of the decade.
Yes, but not even like at least with neo ska or neo swing, there's this idea that we're looking back to something before. This just seemed like meathead consumerism to me. I don't know why I found it so off-putting.
Would you put Rage Against the Machine in there?
Rage Against the Machine is one of the funniest bands. I remember quite liking their album. Now they come out of they're the mixing of 2 scenes. I believe was it Inside Out? Like the lead singer actually came from a hardcore punk band, like one of those hardcore kind of metal punk bands. And the guitarist was in kind of one of those more alternative metal bands, and he very much was into like the guitar tech stuff. I like the Rage Against the Machine. But I remember Ian MacKaye pointing something out. Now, Ian MacKaye of Fugazi was like, we run our own record label. We control the prices of the CD and the tickets. So we control the means of productions here. So we think it's ethical. Ironically, Ian MacKaye ended up becoming a millionaire, but that's a whole other thing. Rage Against the Machine, it was pretty good. I wouldn't put them in with the new metal, though the new metal are their children. Oh, yeah, they were their children.
Yeah,
but the funniest thing about Rage
album that was a mixture of so many.
Yeah, for sure, and also Body Count with Ice-T and all that, for sure.
Exactly.
And Faith No More. There's a few precursors, but the funny thing is that Rage Against the Machine shows you that corporations only care about making money. You're talking about like this hardcore. We want to bring in communist revolution, and we are on Sony Records. And so there's like that F you don't do what you tell me, and you have like, you know, a bunch of frat boys or future engineers screaming that. It's like, yo, yeah, revolution. We'll market that. It sells. It's not like this stuff really. I mean, maybe they brought awareness to some things, but it's like.
I remember feeling that going back to. I remember feeling that going back to the late '80s. Tracy Chapman with her folk guitar, you know, talking about a revolution, and I'm sitting there going like, don't you realize that means bloodshed? You know, it's kind of like, and you're making it sound so pretty. And then you get Rage Against the Machine, and they sound like, yeah, we're against the machine. I mean, and one of the big people at the end of the 90s also is Marilyn Manson. And he comes out, and he's against the police and against the church and against the schools. And he's on the biggest record company on earth, Interscope Records, which is owned by Universal. And I'm sitting there going, how come you don't do any songs about that?
Well, the problem is with all of that stuff, right? Now, I quite like the Fast Car song by Tracy Chapman, but that's a whole other thing.
Yeah, well, it's a pretty song. Fast Car is great, but I got another one.
I've met a lot of people like this. I mean, you're talking about people who talk about things in principle on the abstract, that if anything ever came close to that, they would back out in a minute. So that's people talking on the theoretical. Right, it's like people having a religious belief, in my opinion, in some ways. But this is a whole thing we could digress on. But the thing is with Marilyn Manson, with Marilyn Manson, it was like the last stand of what we call like, because there was this whole other thing with the PMRC in the 80s with this like shock about metal and rock. And the thing is that, you know, if you're a shock rocker, you want the audience to be shocked. If somebody just comes up and goes, this is just kind of a little bit immature, you listening to this death metal, but hey, if you want to listen to it, fine. But you understand this is kind of immature. If you give it a reaction like that, it doesn't really have any much strength anymore, right?
No.
So Marilyn Manson basically takes that underground industrial, the underground extreme metal, goth, and he makes it much more mainstream and palatable.
Right.
But then he's doing this on a mainstream level, and it's funny because, as you said, this is just a marketed product. That's all it is. At the end of the day, it's a marketed product. So you can talk about this abstract nihilism. I'm selling this, but it's. This is why I was always having a problem with a lot of the censorship issues with that kind of music, because it's like you're actually giving them fuel. If people kind of ignored these people, they would kind of go away, or maybe they do something different. They'd burn out on this and they try something more intelligent, you know, because that's what often happened to musicians. You can sit there and go, you know, talk about extreme devil worship or whatever, but usually that kind of gets boring pretty fast.
Right.
You know, it's not very deep thinking, right? So
yeah. Well, it's interesting. There were a couple of scenes at the tail end, almost wanting to be the final boss of the 20th century and the heralder of the new dark 21st century. One of them was the digital hardcore scene that was.
Oh yeah.
Which took, you know, their sampled cuts were now the Sex Pistols. You know, they were mixing rap and industrial and hardcore into this one unholy mixture. There was about 3 or 4 or 5 bands related to this, with I think it was Alec Empire kind of at the center, and there was when I was out of music by that point. Yeah, whose name I don't even mention because they were so weird, and they had their videos on. I would tell you off the air, but I don't want people searching this band. But it was a group of women who did some just truly disturbing stuff in the UK. And,
I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, they're just, you know, people were trying to find edges to push against. For instance, kind of waiting in the wings for a lot of this stuff, there was kind of an extreme culture of ideas, and it was coming out of places like the Feral House publications in Los Angeles area, and out of that, and they came out of the Amok Press. And these people, you know, they actually got in trouble because they had a catalog where they would sell everything from the Anarchist Handbook, which has instructions for the making of devices you don't want to make. And they would do things that were extreme on every single level they could find. And this kind of thing was kind of seeping in, but the problem was it couldn't get out. I often think that this kind of scene, we're just waiting for it to come back but in a way, some of the stuff we've seen in the last few years has been related to this kind of overturning all the normal reality. But it's not really part of the music scene, although it affected it and was affected by it. But I think that we finally got to a place, and this is where, you know, we can talk about, well, let's do this. So what do you think happened? Why did the 21st century taper off? Had we just gone too far?
I think there was a couple of things, and I don't know what it is, but with the music industry, again, you had that commodification where even the underground is commodified. So we exemplified that with Rage Against the Machine with Marilyn Manson. But for some reason, up through that came those girl diva singers that you talked about. Mm-hmm. And it seemed to be so ubiquitous and so everywhere. It's not that necessarily everyone liked it, but it seemed like that was the new landscape, that we live in this commercial world, that youth commercial teen culture that you're talking about.
Well, but yeah, also, at the end of the 90s, you had all those neo pop, rock, swing, whatever movements.
Yeah.
But also had, in movies, you had the new teen sex comedies. You had the new teen horror films.
Yes.
And I think Britney Spears, whatever you may think of her, is when she comes and lands in 1999, that is the sign of the end for the rock scene. I mean,
yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, you had people continuing on. No, I'll be honest, I was kind of getting I was totally out of music by that point. I did listen to some of the post rock stuff in the years 2000, but even you have this idea of post rock. Well, what comes after that? If your reference is post something, then you're referencing the thing before. But if anything comes after that, it can't be like post this, right? So you're at an essential end.
Well,
the other thing, go ahead.
Radio station at the beginning of that era, and I got a lot of that stuff sent to me. I'm actually going to make a video pretty soon of this period of. I've kind of broken it down into two. One is the late '90s, the stuff that was kind of not being sold to the big world, and the other is the aughts and all the stuff. There was actually great music that nobody saw, but it wasn't even underground. It just simply wasn't being. Nobody was being pointed at this. You had to know that, if I went to San Francisco and went to this one club, I would see these neo cabaret acts or something like that.
Yeah, well, I think there was the other thing was the fragmentation from the internet, which is what we're in now. So there's
you're right.
There's no happy days anymore, which meaning like in the 70s, people would say, "Did you see Happy Days last night?" Because everyone would watch that TV show. So the common culture starts to fragment a lot more. Right. But you still get these very, like the commerciality in from the 2000s onward, things get more and more commercial, but there's probably in the underground this more and more kind of elite intellectual indie rock at the same time happening.
Yeah, at the same time, those people don't have a way forward. They're kind of like last remnants.
Yeah.
Hoping their sells, hoping somebody discovers them. It's like, okay, White Stripes made money, maybe we can too. That kind of
thing. I remember seeing but the thing is with. Well, I made a video called like the last big rock album to make an impact on a mainstream level, and I would argue it was OK Computer by Radiohead.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, you do get big acts, but they all seem retro. Like to me, the White Stripes is a retro band. Yeah, certainly things like the Hives are, right?
Yeah.
So I remember hearing that stuff and I liked it. And there were these kind of interesting, kind of more intellectual bands like in Canada, Arcade Fire was a band. Mm-hmm. And they're not bad, but I never really found it inspiring in any way. Like maybe the rock story just ended.
I'm like, what's the point?
Yeah, like they're interesting, but not that interesting. And I'm sure there's probably more incredible guitar players than there had been in any other time period operating right now. I just wouldn't know about any of them.
Well, a lot of them are also on YouTube. And these are people who will sit and obsess over a certain piece of music and then learn to imitate it. And the funny thing about that is they go through endless takes to get that one perfect take that they put on YouTube.
Mm.
And so the way I look at it is the 20th century, the late 20th century was a large cultural war. And it was, the traditional cultures, the black and white traditional cultures were all consumed by either, by the end, by commercialism. And then the forces that were trying to fight that, the rock and whatnot, kind of burned out on nihilism. And irony. Kurt Cobain is great, but he had no answer to his dilemma. And unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be anyone close enough to him to help him find a way through. So, to me, that the moment when he died that's the moment when okay, it's all going to go downhill from here. And but the way I look at it is there's like a huge fire. A bonfire of amazing culture and it circles mostly around music in the second half of the 20th century. But by the time you get to the odds, what you're now dealing with is just the embers.
Yeah.
You're no longer dealing with, here and there, you'll touch them, ooh, that's hot, that's nice. But you're no longer, it's not so edgy anymore. And it's the commercialization, but even that is going to trip up over stuff like Napster. And so Tower Records goes down. The biggest record store in America goes down because of Napster.
Yep.
And so you end up with a situation. It's like when you ask people what music they listen to now, people, if you meet six people, you meet six people listening to different kinds of stuff. There's no unity, as you were saying.
Yeah, you're up. I would absolutely agree with that. I think one of the stories you could talk about is, you go back to the early 60s and you have the Brill building with the professional songwriters and the corporations are in complete control. And now, I mean, people have argued why they like to have the individual, like, diva singer or hip hop artist is you have a single artist. The record company makes all the music. They own all the rights to the music. In fact, at this point, I don't even think people are making the music. I think it's just done all on computer.
Yeah.
And you have complete control. I mean, if you have a rock band and, drug problems, breakups, all these different hassles. And but the thing was, the big story was this sort of fight between artists and corporations. And the band, the Beatles, was the band that they wrote their own songs and they had complete artistic control. And you had these peaks and waves where, so first, so say like the mid 60s to mid 70s, you have artists really in control. And then you have that sort of bump in the late 80s, early 90s, where the artists are in control again. But it's always been this way of corporations. We've got to kind of tame this thing. And when you let them
they
tame
also
it,
look for all the imitations of it. And what they love to find is a young person who doesn't know anything about business but has talent.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's
so they'll put that person forward. Interestingly enough, how many of the divas of the aughts and the teens started off in the Disney factory.
Oh, yeah.
And then were sent forward into the world, and even if they weren't, like Taylor Swift wasn't directly related to Disney, she was totally a Disney princess girl. And so, you have this scene so that, nobody ever thinks about the people in Taylor Swift's band. No one thinks about the people who play with The Weeknd. Nobody thinks about the people who play with any 24 or so name acts you can think of. Who plays behind Olivia Rodriguez? I have no idea. But that's where we are. We're at the point where you have just this figure who represents something. And they're always keeping it representing to the young, of course. Meanwhile, the older generations are going, hey, what about us? What about the music we used to like? To which the answer is, we don't care. You're done. You don't buy music anymore.
Yeah.
I think the ultimate rock and roll history book will end with the last concert of the Rolling Stones.
Yes.
Which is coming probably in this decade.
Yeah. I saw the Stones in 1989. I bought tickets off the scalpers.
Right.
And I thought we paid $60 for our tickets and we thought it was super expensive then.
Right.
And it was called the Steel Wheels was the album. It was called the Steel Wheelchairs Tour, even in 89. And the fact that, and they're still going.
Yeah. They felt like ancient rock legends at that point already.
Yeah. But I think you're right. And so I think your conclusion there is absolutely correct about how the flame has gone out and we just got embers and no one knows what else to do. And there's also this fragmentation and there's also this corporate control of music and sound. And Andy Edwards talked about everyone wanting to produce to where you have perfection, but when you keep making it perfect, eventually you have no soul. So that's why we just have computers and AI music's next. AI music's next.
Been to many concerts. And I can tell you, the ones where there's an edge on it and you don't know what's going to happen are by far the better concerts than the ones that are super polished and super professional. And these people feel like they could imitate this show endlessly across the country or the world.
Well, yeah, this idea of drummers having a click track where they know exactly how to play. Like, none of the bands I saw back in the day had that. That's what made it more interesting.
Yeah.
So anyway. Wow, that's kind of depressing. So,
but here's the thing. This is what my point is for my, the Anadromist channel, and I mention this a bit on the Anadrome now and then, but it's more on the Anadromist channel. Is that we have to get back to reality, and in music, what that means is we need to go to hear people sing who are actually singing.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be big concerts at all. In fact, the bigger the concert, the more it's going to be siphoned through the technology of production. So that what you're hearing, when you're listening to Taylor Swift, how much of what you're hearing is actually occurring while you're hearing it, and how much is blended in? I mean, we don't know anymore. And you're right. AI is going to turn everything into a big plastic Fisher Price toy, and it's going to be something that, I play with the imagery and the music of this. I've experimented enough to know, like, oh, this is terrible. And this new Google VO3, I mean, it looks really good and really terrible at the same time. It's the definition of commercial, because it's all trained on commercial imagery, commercial music, the stuff that was hits, and all of this stuff. Whereas the stuff we like, whether it's Per Ubu or the Melvins or any half a dozen other bands that are kind of on the edge, that's what makes it interesting. Sure. You say there's something at stake here. That's what made rock and roll and rock music and metal and punk and everything, grunge, so interesting, is that something was at stake. And now, as far as the large culture goes, nothing is at stake.
No. And nothing is, the other thing is the absolute destruction. Maybe this is a conversation for another time, but the absolute destruction of the attention span.
Of the what?
The attention span. That's the other factor too.
Yeah, welcome to the nightmare of the attention economy.
Oh,
yeah. This is why I talk about puppetry, and people are kind of like, why are you talking about that, Byrne? It's because a good puppetry can't really survive on digital screens. I mean, I can put up stuff I've seen, but you won't get it unless you're there. Yeah. It's the same. I think dances should come back, because watching a dance video doesn't convey, but being in the room where dancers are, it's like, wow. I think real painting has to come back. I think real use of one's hands. I think more acoustic music, but not folk music necessarily, but just stuff played live in the room is what's important. And I don't think music will ever get back to that really important position it had in the late 20th century.
No. I think it's just been so heavily commodified. It's just like any other object you buy at a store now.
Well, also, music was a very easy thing to put into a digital format.
Yeah.
Although, it does make me ask, and I have done this in a couple of videos, on why Taylor Swift is so important. I think when people go to a Taylor Swift concert, it's going to be extraordinarily produced. But the thing is, they get the feeling this is the only time we can actually meet with other people who like what we like.
Yeah.
It's a real experience in its very packaged form. But in our world today, we're being atomized from each other.
Yeah.
So the point is to try to reverse that flow. So it's not to make music that's going to change the world, which was one of the problems that music had. The more it became like, we're going to change the world, whether it's, I love Bob Dylan, but he kind of infected everyone else. And he himself backed away from it by 65, that idea of changing the world through protest. But, when you're then watching people, rock against racism or, Rage Against the Machine or whoever is singing what. And nowadays, it's like if you hear someone singing, we're going to change the world, they're often a mouthpiece for the official structures, which is kind of ironic.
Yeah, I mean, but the whole thing is there's an irony between, like, trying to create a social message and then trying to sell units, is that you have this commodification of rebellion, which is the ultimate irony.
Exactly. But that is what it's happened. I'm actually been reading right now about where this all began in the late 19th century in the cabarets of France, is where this idea of music and art to change the world happened. And I'm going to do a video on that pretty soon, but I'm really letting it seep in, because there was also a real great hatred for humanity within that as well. And that kind of goes all the way through. So it's like we're always on guard against the hypocrites. We're always on guard against the bourgeois, against the posers. And then inevitably, the people who are so against those people end up becoming the
Absolutely.
hypocrites,
Absolutely.
posers.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
okay, James. Well, on this cheery note,
yeah, I think we really rounded it up.
let's give people something to think about. And hey, if you're watching this and you have ideas how to bring reality back, not just in music but in everything, leave a comment.
That's
we
for
like
sure.
hearing from you. And so, and you should go over to check out James's channel, 20th Century Music and Arts, and he's got a lot of very interesting stuff there about many of. He kind of goes into fractal detail on many of the bands that I cover more, because I'm often looking at the big picture, but James is looking at some very small pictures that are very fascinating. So go do that. Any last thoughts before we get out of here?
No, I think we covered up and wrapped up where the 20th century left. Yeah, no, it's been over for a quarter of a century, and we still haven't accepted it yet, or maybe So yeah, definitely, I think we've wrapped it up, and it was always great talking to you. And
okay, well, we will do it again. We'll find another subject. I have the feeling the next time we come back, we'll be doing something on horror. It'll be maybe around that time. So James is planning a video coming up where he talks about why his channel is called 20th Century Music and Arts, and we'll leave him.
It might take a little while for that to come out, but definitely we're going to explore that for sure.
Okay, James, we'll catch you later.
Thanks again, Byrne. It's always a pleasure to be on your channel.
Thank you for watching 20th Century Music and Arts. Please like, share, subscribe, and comment. What did you think about the conversation? Thank you.